We often find ourselves pulling away from the world, retreating into the quiet corners of our lives where we believe we'll be safe from pain, judgment, or disappointment. It's an act that may seem harmless at first, even necessary. I need space, we tell ourselves. I need to figure things out, and that might be true. But have you ever stopped to question whether this isolation is truly serving you? Are you retreating because solitude offers clarity and peace, or because you're running from something you've not yet dared to face? The reasons we isolate ourselves are as varied as the human experience itself. For some, it's fear of being judged, fear of being misunderstood, fear of being hurt again. For others, it's exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of navigating relationships that felt more like obligations than connections. And sometimes it's anger or resentment, a quiet rebellion against a world that has failed to meet our expectations. But whatever the reason, the act of pulling away often begins subtly. A missed call here, a declined invitation there. Before we know it, the space we've created for ourselves grows into a chasm, and what once felt like a temporary reprieve from the noise of life becomes a habit, a lifestyle, even a prison. Let's not pretend that isolation is always a deliberate choice, though. Sometimes it sneaks up on us. Life shifts, friendships fade, loved ones move away, relationships end, and suddenly, the circle that once held us together feels empty. We might tell ourselves it's just how life works, that people drift apart, that we've grown older and don't need others as much as we used to. But is that really true? Or are we simply rationalizing the ache of being disconnected, convincing ourselves that we're fine when deep down, a part of us knows we're not? And yet, solitude isn't inherently bad. In fact, it can be a profound source of growth and self-discovery when it's chosen intentionally. The problem arises when isolation becomes less of a choice and more of a reflex, when we withdraw not because we value solitude but because we've learned to fear connection. Why is it, then, that something as fundamental as human connection can feel so fraught, so dangerous? Why do we, as social beings, often find ourselves retreating into loneliness despite knowing the toll it takes on our mental and physical health?
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
You see, we often tell ourselves stories about why we isolate. I'm an introvert, we might say. I just don't like people, or I'm too busy. I don't have time for relationships. These stories can feel true, and to some extent they might be. But how often do we use them as shields, as excuses to avoid the discomfort that comes with vulnerability? Because that's what connection requires: vulnerability. To connect with another person, we have to be willing to show up as we are, flaws and all, and risk being seen for who we truly are. And that's terrifying, isn't it? The possibility of rejection, of criticism, of being hurt, it's enough to make anyone pull back, to trade the warmth of connection for the safety of solitude. But here's the paradox: the very thing we fear, the judgment, the pain, the rejection, is also what makes connection so transformative. When we allow ourselves to be seen and accepted, not despite our imperfections, but because of them, something remarkable happens. We realize that we're not alone, that our struggles and insecurities are not unique but shared. And in that realization, we find a kind of freedom that isolation can never provide. Yet, even knowing this, many of us struggle to take that first step toward reconnecting. Why? Perhaps it's because we've been hurt before. Maybe we've opened ourselves up to someone only to be betrayed or dismissed. And so we tell ourselves it's not worth the risk, that people can't be trusted, that it's better to be alone than to be vulnerable. But is that really true? Or is it just fear speaking, fear that keeps us locked in a cycle of isolation and loneliness? Think about the relationships in your life. How many of them feel truly fulfilling? How many of them allow you to be your authentic self? And if the answer is not many or none, Ask yourself, is it because the people in your life are incapable of deeper connection, or is it because you've built walls so high that no one can climb them? It's not an easy question to answer, but it's an important one. Because while we can't control how others show up in our lives, we can control how we show up in theirs. But let's not oversimplify this. Reconnecting with others isn't as easy as flipping a switch. It requires effort, patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort. And for those of us who've been isolated for a long time, it can feel overwhelming, even impossible. Where do you start? How do you rebuild connections when the very thought of reaching out feels like a mountain you're not strong enough to climb? One place to start is by examining the beliefs that keep you isolated. What stories are you telling yourself about connection? Do you believe that people are inherently selfish or untrustworthy? Do you believe that you're unworthy of love or friendship? Or maybe you believe that you're better off alone, that relationships are more trouble than they're worth. Whatever those beliefs are, challenge them. Ask yourself where they come from and whether they're serving you. Because often, the barriers to connection aren't external, they're internal. Another step is to start small. You don't have to dive headfirst into deep, emotional conversations or rekindle every friendship you've ever had. Connection can begin with something as simple as a smile, a kind word, or a shared moment of laughter. It can be as casual as texting an old friend to say, "Hey, I was thinking about you. How have you been?" The important thing is to take that first step, however small it might be, and to keep taking steps even when it feels uncomfortable. And it will feel uncomfortable at times. There will be moments when you second-guess yourself, when you wonder if it's worth the effort, when old fears and insecurities rear their heads. But remember, this growth is rarely comfortable. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're doing something meaningful. And in those moments of doubt, remind yourself of what's at stake. What kind of life do you want to live? One that's rich with connection, or one that's defined by loneliness? The choice is yours. But let's not forget that connection isn't just about reaching out to others, it's also about reconnecting with yourself. Because how can we expect to form meaningful relationships with others if we're not even in touch with our own needs, desires, and emotions? Isolation often disconnects us not just from the world but from ourselves. We lose sight of who we are, what we value, and what we want out of life. So take the time to sit with yourself, to ask the hard questions, to listen to what your inner voice is telling you. Because the more connected you are with yourself, the easier it will be to connect with others. And as you navigate this journey back to connection, be patient with yourself. Healing takes time, and so does rebuilding relationships. There will be setbacks and challenges, moments when you feel like giving up. But don't let those moments define you. Keep moving forward, even if it's one small step at a time. Because every step you take, no matter how small, is a step toward a life that's richer, fuller, and more connected. So where do we go from here? How do we continue this journey toward reconnection, not just with others, but with ourselves? The answers may not come easily, but they're worth seeking. Because in the end, the question isn't just why we isolate ourselves, it's whether we're willing to do what it takes to reconnect. And that's a question only you can answer. If we truly want to understand why we isolate ourselves and how we can reconnect, we need to go deeper. We need to examine not just the surface level behaviors that keep us apart, but the deeper forces shaping them. Because isolation is rarely just about the external circumstances of our lives, it's rooted in the stories we carry, the wounds we bear, and the fears we don't always name. To move forward, we have to confront these truths, no matter how uncomfortable they may be. Let's begin with something fundamental. Why do we fear connection? It's easy to say that we're afraid of being judged or rejected, but what's really behind those fears? Perhaps it's this connection requires us to confront the fact that we are vulnerable. To connect with others is to admit that we need them, that we are not self-sufficient, that we crave love, acceptance, and understanding. And for many of us, that vulnerability feels like a weakness. We've been taught, whether by life, culture, or our own experiences, that to need others is to risk being let down. That to open our hearts is to risk having them broken. And perhaps worst of all, that to rely on others is to risk losing control. Control, after all, is one of the illusions we cling to most tightly. When we isolate ourselves, we feel like we're in control of our environment, our emotions, and our relationships. We tell ourselves, if I don't let anyone in, no one can hurt me, but what we fail to realize is that this control is an illusion. Because even in isolation, we are not truly safe. The pain of loneliness, the ache of disconnection, the void left by unexpressed love, these things hurt just as much, if not more, than the risks we're trying to avoid. So the question becomes, is the trade-off worth it? Are we willing to sacrifice the richness of human connection for the fleeting comfort of control? But fear isn't the only force driving isolation. For many of us, there's also a kind of exhaustion, a weariness that comes from years of trying to connect in a world that often feels indifferent, harsh, or even hostile. Maybe you've felt it yourself. Maybe you've tried to open up to someone, only to be met with dismissal or misunderstanding. Maybe you've poured your energy into relationships, only to feel unappreciated or taken for granted. Or maybe you've been burned one too many times, and now the idea of putting yourself out there feels unbearable. If that's the case, it's no wonder you've pulled away. Who wouldn't? But here's the hard truth: while isolation might feel like a way to protect yourself, it often leads to the very thing you're trying to avoid: pain. Think about it this way: when we isolate ourselves, we create a narrative about the world and our place in it. People don't care about me, no one understands me, I'm better off on my own. These stories might feel true, especially if they're based on real experiences, but they're not the whole truth. They're a lens, a way of interpreting the world that reinforces our isolation. And the longer we stay isolated, the more these stories solidify, becoming a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. After all, how can we expect to find connection if we've already decided it's impossible? But here's the thing: connection doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's not something that magically appears when the right person comes along or when circumstances align perfectly. Connection is something we create actively, intentionally, and sometimes imperfectly. It requires effort, yes, but also a willingness to risk failure. Because the truth is, not every connection will succeed. Not every relationship will be fulfilling. And not every attempt to reach out will be met with open arms. But does that mean we should stop trying? Or does it mean we need to redefine what success looks like? Take a moment to consider this: what does connection mean to you? Is it about finding someone who understands you completely, who shares your every thought and feeling? Or is it about something simpler: being seen, heard, and valued for who you are? Because if it's the latter, then connection doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require you to be flawless or for others to be either. It only requires a willingness to show up, to be present, and to let go of the idea that you have to earn love or acceptance. You don't. You are already worthy of connection simply by being human. Still, that doesn't mean the process is easy. One of the greatest barriers to connection is the weight of our past. The wounds we carry, whether from childhood, relationships, or society, don't just disappear when we decide we want to connect. They linger, shaping how we see ourselves and others. Maybe you've been told you're too much or not enough. Maybe you've been abandoned, betrayed, or ridiculed. These experiences leave scars, and those scars can make it hard to trust again. But here's the thing about scars: they're a sign of healing. They're a reminder that no matter how much you've been hurt, you've survived. And if you've survived, you can also grow. Growth, however, requires honesty. It requires us to look at ourselves and ask, how am I contributing to my own isolation? Am I holding on to grudges, resentments, or unrealistic expectations? Am I avoiding connection because it feels safer, or because I've convinced myself it's not worth the effort? And perhaps most importantly, am I willing to take responsibility for my own happiness rather than waiting for someone else to fix it? These questions aren't easy to answer, but they're necessary. Because until we take responsibility for our own lives, we remain trapped, not by others, but by our own choices. But taking responsibility doesn't mean blaming yourself. It doesn't mean you're at fault for the pain you've experienced or the struggles you faced. It simply means recognizing that you have the power to change your circumstances. You have the power to reach out, to let go of the stories that no longer serve you, and to create the connections you crave. And yes, that power comes with risk. Yes, it comes with uncertainty. But it also comes with possibility, the possibility of a life that feels full, meaningful, and connected. So where do we go from here? How do we begin to rebuild the bridges we've burned or abandoned? The answer, I think, lies in small, intentional steps. Start with the people who are already in your life, the ones you trust, even a little. Reach out, not with grand gestures, but with simple acts of kindness. Send a text, make a call, invite someone for coffee. Let them know you're thinking of them, that you value their presence. And if you're met with hesitation or rejection, don't let it close you off. Remember, connection is a two-way street, and not everyone will be ready or able to meet you where you are. That's okay. Keep trying. Keep showing up. And while you're reaching out to others, don't forget to reach inward as well. Take the time to understand yourself, your fears, your needs, your desires. What are the stories you've been telling yourself about connection? And are they true, or are they holding you back? Challenge those stories. Rewrite them if you need to. Because the more you understand yourself, the more you'll be able to show up authentically in your relationships. And authenticity is the foundation of true connection. But perhaps the most important step is this: be patient. Connection takes time, and so does healing. There will be setbacks, moments of doubt, and times when you feel like giving up. But don't let those moments define you. Keep moving forward, even if it's one small step at a time. Because every step you take brings you closer to the life you want, a life filled with connection, meaning, and joy. As we move closer to understanding how we can reconnect with others and ourselves, we must confront a difficult truth: isolation often feels safer than connection because it allows us to avoid the messiness of human relationships. Relationships, no matter how meaningful, are imperfect. They are full of misunderstandings, disappointments, and moments of vulnerability that can sometimes feel unbearable. But here's the paradox: it is precisely through this imperfection, this unpredictability, that we experience the depth and richness of life. So the question we must ask ourselves is this: are we willing to trade the fullness of human connection for the illusion of safety? When we isolate, what we're often seeking isn't just physical solitude, it's emotional insulation. We want to shield ourselves from the pain that comes with opening up, from the possibility of being let down, from the fear of being exposed. But insulation carries a cost. When we shut out the bad, we also shut out the good. We lose the joy of shared laughter, the comfort of being understood, the sense of belonging that comes from simply being in the presence of another human being who cares for us. And over time, this loss accumulates. It eats away at us in ways we may not even recognize until the emptiness becomes too loud to ignore. But let's go deeper. What are we really afraid of when we avoid connection? Is it the other person's judgment, or is it our own? Is it the possibility that someone might reject us for who we are, or is it the fear that their rejection will confirm what we already suspect that we are, in some way unworthy? This is where things get uncomfortable because the truth is, much of the fear that drives isolation comes from within. It's not just about what others might see in us, it's about what we see in ourselves. So let me ask you, when you look at yourself, what do you see? Do you see someone who is flawed but worthy of love? Or do you see someone who needs to hide, someone who isn't enough? These questions aren't easy to answer, but they matter, because the way we see ourselves shapes the way we engage with others. If we believe we are unworthy, we will approach relationships from a place of fear and defensiveness. We will push people away before they have a chance to get close. And in doing so, we will create the very loneliness we are trying to avoid. But what if we challenge that narrative? What if we stopped seeing our flaws as barriers to connection and started seeing them as bridges? After all, it is often through our imperfections that we relate to one another. Isn't it true that some of the deepest connections in your life have come from moments of shared vulnerability, from admitting your fears, your struggles, your humanity? Connection doesn't require perfection. It requires authenticity. And authenticity begins with self-acceptance. Of course, self-acceptance is easier said than done. Many of us carry wounds from the past that make it difficult to see ourselves clearly. Maybe you've been told that you're too much or not enough. Maybe you've been criticized, dismissed, or abandoned in ways that left scars. But here's the thing about scars: they don't define you. They are a part of your story, yes, but they are not the whole story. And they don't have to dictate your future. One way to begin the process of self-acceptance is to practice self-compassion. Imagine speaking to yourself with the same kindness and understanding you would offer a dear friend. When you make a mistake, instead of berating yourself, remind yourself that mistakes are a natural part of being human. When you feel inadequate, instead of shutting down, remind yourself that everyone feels that way sometimes. Self-compassion is not about ignoring your flaws, it's about recognizing that your flaws do not make you unworthy of love or connection. But self-acceptance is only one piece of the puzzle. To truly reconnect, we must also be willing to take risks. And yes, connection is a risk. When we open ourselves up to others, we expose ourselves to the possibility of rejection, disappointment, and even betrayal. But we also open ourselves up to the possibility of love, joy, and belonging. The question is, which possibility are you willing to live for? Because avoiding pain may keep you safe, but it won't make you happy. So how do we take those risks? How do we move from isolation to connection when the thought of reaching out feels overwhelming? Start small. Connection doesn't have to begin with grand gestures or deep conversations. It can start with a smile, a kind word, or a simple text message. It can be as easy as asking someone how their day was and really listening to their answer. The key is to show up, even when it feels uncomfortable, even when you're not sure what to say. Because connection isn't about saying the perfect thing, it's about being present. And as you take these small steps, be prepared for setbacks. Not every attempt to connect will be successful. Some people may not respond the way you hope. Some relationships may not grow the way you want them to. But that's okay. Connection is not about finding the perfect relationship. It's about creating opportunities for connection wherever you can. And sometimes, those opportunities will surprise you. A chance encounter, a shared moment, a simple act of kindness, these are the seeds of connection that, over time, can grow into something meaningful. But let's not forget that reconnecting with others also requires reconnecting with yourself. Isolation often disconnects us not just from the world, but from our own emotions, desires, and values. When was the last time you truly sat with yourself without distraction and asked, what do I need? What do I want? What matters to me? These questions are not always easy to answer, but they are essential. Because the more connected you are with yourself, the more authentically you can show up in your relationships with others. And as you reconnect with yourself, you may find that some of your beliefs about connection begin to shift. You may realize that the world is not as harsh as you once thought, that people are not as judgmental as you feared, and that you are not as unworthy as you believed. These realizations won't come all at once, and they won't erase the pain of the past, but they will open the door to a new way of being, a way that is rooted in connection, not fear. So where does this leave us? If isolation is the problem and connection is the solution, then the path forward is clear. We must choose connection, even when it feels hard, even when it feels risky. We must be willing to show up, to be seen, and to let others into our lives. And we must do so not because we need others to complete us, but because connection is what makes life meaningful. It is through our relationships with others and with ourselves that we find the richness, the depth, and the beauty of being human. But let me leave you with one final thought, one final question. What kind of life do you want to live? A life defined by fear, control, and isolation, or a life filled with connection, love, and belonging? The choice is yours, and while the path to connection may not be easy, it is always worth it. Because in the end, we are not meant to walk this life alone. We are meant to walk it together. So take the risk. Reach out, reconnect, and remember you are worthy of connection just as you are, always.